edit it in, can't you?
You can edit it in. You don't need me to do the outro again. Because I can't nail that a second time. Not that I nailed it the first. Yeah, really. That would be great if I nailed it at all. Welcome to the Georgia Politics Podcast. I am your host, Preston Thompson. It is February 15th, 2019. We have a great panel of guests today, 5 in total, including myself. I'm going to go around the room, let them introduce themselves.
I am Pallavi Purkayastha. I'm a Democratic strategist as well as a legislative aide at the Georgia State Capitol.
This is Craig Kidd. I am Chief of Staff to the Mayor of Johns Creek and the first Vice Chairman of the Fulton County Republican Party.
I'm Hans Appen. I help Daniel and Preston run the show, and just a politics junkie, so excited these politicos are allowing me to be on the show today.
Fred Hicks, political strategist, founder of HEG LLC, a political consulting firm.
First time on the show for Fred. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, welcome, Fred.
Only my second, so.
Lots of rookies. So, top of the news this week. Actually, it's news last week, but I wanted to hold off a little bit, maybe get some more information on it, get some more guests in to have some voices on. Changes coming to Stone Mountain, possibly. A recent statement from Attorney General Chris Carr, an interview given in his office in the state capitol, revealed kind of an interesting strategy for how to change the context of Stone Mountain, an issue that was brought up during the campaign, very briefly, I would say, and then kind of receded as the positions started to move and change a little bit. We can talk about that. But let me read the quote real quick that sparked a little bit of conversation, and we'll get right into it. This is Attorney General Chris Carr. I'm a big believer in history by addition, not history by subtraction or deletion. I think it's important for us to have a conversation about the facts, all the facts, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the indifferent. Now, this is in relation to putting a bell tower on the top of Stone Mountain in honor of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So I know there's a group out there that wants to remove the Confederate etchings on Stone Mountain. There's a group that wants to leave them and not do anything. And then there's a group that kind of wants a middling solution, something like this one. Does this have a possibility of going anywhere?
Well, I will chime in on that as the resident black guy on the panel today. But also as someone who worked on this issue a few years ago with then State Rep LaDon Blackett-Jones after the shooting in Charleston. And what we actually proposed to Stone Mountain at the time was that, again, we don't believe in addition by subtraction, but saying, hey, you know what, let's remove the Confederate flags and let's actually create a museum that tells the whole story, not a version of the story. It's not the peculiar institution of slavery. People were not happy workers. They were slaves who worked and were brought here against their choice, against their will. And so,
now, when you say the flags, do you also mean the carvings?
So the carvings are a whole different thing, but that's a big old thing.
Sorry,
right? So
please continue then. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. And so, and with respect to the carvings, that's an entirely different issue, and that took a long time to develop. But while I still remain a proponent of a museum there that tells the entire history, including why Stone Mountain and the carvings and all that were there. And I think this year is actually really good year to do it, as this is the 400th anniversary of the first slaves arriving in the United States. So this would be a perfect time to do something about it.
Refresh my memory, because it's been a couple of years since I've been to Stone Mountain, and it's been a couple of years since I've done anything than walk around the greenery. What story is being told now? Because I don't remember anything praising the Confederacy at Stone Mountain, or at least going into what
the flags are a pretty big thing there, the Confederate symbols there, and also the etchings. So you don't have to verbally tell a story. You can tell a story visually, and as a matter of fact, symbols are the oldest form of storytelling. They predate the actual spoken word. So I'm actually going to push back against that narrative that you have to have something piping over a system there. So and Stone Mountain was dedicated for the very purpose of reminding people of what happened. Well, not of what happened, but of hate. And I think we'd also be remiss in ignoring the fact that the Klan was reconstituted at the top of Stone Mountain in the wake of the situation right over here in Marietta with Leo. And so it's not just a black issue, right? That he was a Jewish gentleman. And this is, we can't deny or try to whitewash or cover the history on it. And I think the sooner we actually address it and actually create something that talks about it and use it as a learning opportunity. Look, society evolves, right? And we live right now in a moment where we talk about the hashtag Me Too, whereas issues just 5 years ago wouldn't have been addressed or given any kind of redress. But society evolves, and part of that evolution is acknowledging the past and then making a plan and moving forward. So I'm not saying we live in it. I'm saying we have to acknowledge it, and denying it doesn't do anything. It just keeps the wounds fresh.
I was listening to a podcast this weekend with the former mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, and he was speaking. He sort of famously removed the Confederate statues in downtown New Orleans, and actually they were talking a little bit about about Stone Mountain on that show, and they were talking. They were telling us some things I didn't know about, that it was, the artist was a member of the KKK.
Yep.
It opened on the 100-year anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's assassination. And the opening event was some sort of KKK rally, annual
gathering
meeting.
point.
Yeah.
Well, this
let's be clear. The Stone Mountain is nothing but a living, breathing monument to the hate-filled aspects of the Confederacy. That's all it is. Now, the authority has made it into one of the biggest tourist events, and you can go sledding there, manufacturing snow, and all that kind of stuff there. But that doesn't change why it was created.
This brings up a good point. I'm glad you brought up Mitch Landrieu, because I think Stone Mountain is historically treated differently in this respect, because it's not just a statue. It's not just a monument. It's not just a gravestone or whatever it could be. It's also a tourist attraction with other amenities, and the carvings themselves are also huge and a massive labor. And you can talk about some of the statues and how they could be considered works of art, but is Stone Mountain treated differently because of its size, scope, scale, and use?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I remember when I first moved here from India, anytime family came over, we took them to Stone Mountain. And you look at the fireworks show, you don't feel like it's part of Haiti. You feel patriotic. So the way they market it, it's definitely very different than what it actually stands for.
The water is muddy. The lines are not clearly drawn between this is the historic context and this is the part where you slide down a hill.
People take their wedding photos there. I mean,
Sure.
my wife and I took our engagement photos, there, and there's 1,000 different things to do.
People go walking.
It's funny. I like to joke that I have a unique perspective on it, that because I'm from New York. My family's from New York. Like most people who moved to North Fulton in the 80s, we were all from New York, Pennsylvania, or Ohio. So I have no historic affinity for Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, and Robert E. Lee. I think you can make a compelling case that 2 of the 3 of them were downright traitors. And I would say if we were going to sandblast the 3 of them off, then my perspective, we should replace it with Ulysses S. Grant, George Meade, and General Sherman. If Sherman is too much for people, we can replace him with George Thomas, who was really great because he was a Virginian who stayed in the Union and is now famously known as the Rock of Chickamauga. I always mispronounce that, Chickamauga, whatever.
But you understand what you're asking here is, like, how big is that etching? I mean, it's huge.
Oh yeah, there's no way you're getting rid of that.
But that's what I'm saying is, like, is sandblasting even on the table?
It's called Stone Mountain.
Yeah,
It's an actual mountain.
Let me phrase it this way, since I don't know, did anybody here grow up in South Georgia or rural Georgia?
By birth, I'm from South Georgia.
Okay. So I was at a GMA conference last year, and I was sitting down next to the mayor of a middle-sized, middle Georgia town. And I was asking him, I said, so what's going on in your town? What are the issues coming up? What's going on in your town? He said, well, we just had a factory close, so we got some problems there. And we have these people who want to get rid of all of our statues. So here's the mayor of a town who, given an open floor, see what's going on in his town. Number 1 was the economy, and then number 2 was the Confederate statue the debate. So I mentioned that story just to show how important it is to the people of Middle and South Georgia that these statues stay where they are, or however you want to phrase it. So we might, a lot of people in the suburbs might not want to, don't think of this as a salient issue. But once you get outside of Metro Atlanta, I mean, it's really important. I imagine on both sides of the aisle, too.
But to be fair, you can see Stone Mountain from 285. The community surrounding Stone Mountain does not exactly represent the original purpose of it.
But I guess my point being is this is not a DeKalb County issue. This is not a Metro Atlanta issue. This is a state of Georgia issue.
Well,
So
I think that's up for debate.
I'm going to go back a little bit broader than that. So there are two things. One, I didn't get from your story that, everyone in Middle Georgia wants to keep Confederate statues.
No, that wasn't the intent. It was that how important it was of an issue. We might see this as the number 20 issue facing Georgia. But once you get out of Metro Atlanta, that was number 2. And remember, number 1 was bad economics. So it shows how important this issue is to them.
Well, and I think this current sort of environment in which we live, right, certainly brings that to the forefront. With Charlottesville in 2017 and, the rise and spike in hate crimes, not just against African Americans, but against brown people and people of different religions. So, yeah, it certainly is re-entered the conversation. And, of course, we're all connected via social media now. So that makes the news or allows the news to travel faster than it would have before. But the thing is that Stone Mountain isn't just a Georgia issue. I want to go back to something. One of the things I learned when we met with the Stone Mountain Authority, and we had several meetings with them, is that Stone Mountain is actually a little different. That even if the people who manage the property said, hey, we want to do something different, they actually have a separate board and a separate authority, and they are protected from it. So only the board can really authorize any sort of changes.
Is that because it has monument status?
Well, that happened in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, and people were concerned that it might get caught up and swept, and the monument would be removed, and things would be moved. So, to make sure that part of history and that story is of the Confederacy and dominance, racial dominance, was preserved, they created a separate authority, and it's just so it's not even just a passive thing, and it's in the primary source document. They weren't documents; they weren't hiding why they did it, so we don't have to infer why that was done. So that's something that, if we're going to make a fundamental change, that the process is a bit more difficult than just saying, hey, I want to do something. Even adding something like a bell tower to it. So, and then the other thing about the bell tower is there's so much more to Black history than Martin Luther King Jr., right? I mean, that's doing a disservice to, why don't we put the images of people shackled and working in fields, right? If we're going to do the whole story, if you're going to keep the 3 people up there, or the people who are on the mountain, let's talk about what they were fighting for. Let's talk about what they were doing, what they represented. And it was not just simply about, supply and demand. It was who was supplying, labor costs and all of that. And that would be our argument, is that, again, keep it there, but let's tell the full story.
I did wonder that, kind of skipping ahead to the 1960s and commemorating Dr. King, does that skip over? That doesn't exactly put the original monument in context, right? Correct. It puts the, eventual movement that comes 100 years later in context, but it doesn't actually contextualize the first bit. So is the idea of addition, not subtraction, that Chris Carr is floating here, is that likely to go anywhere with kind of the governing board that's over it, or anywhere in the legislature or anything like that?
I hope.
Small steps.
I mean, I will say, as someone who's been following this issue for a long time, the conversation itself, having happened from a Republican attorney general to a legislature that seems ready to get behind something like this, is progress, even if it's small.
Well, it's progress or it's defense, right? Trying to preserve your majority. 2020 is coming.
And on that note, let's move on. Good as time as any to move on.
Okay.
Did you have something to add?
No, I guess going back to my original thought that nobody in Johns Creek, Roswell, or East Cobb is going to vote in a House election based on what happens to Stone Mountain, I guess going back to the issue of this issue varies in where you are on its import, I guess.
I think Stone Mountain is a very small aspect, a really small part of the conversation. This is a race conversation. This is a history conversation. And I agree with Fred about the museum, because MLK it's a whitewashed, rosy, feel-good story about the Civil Rights Movement. We don't really talk about everything that he did, everything that people didn't agree with. Now he's just hailed as a hero, and we don't really see the nasty side of that history. And we don't talk about slavery when we talk about MLK. So I think the conversation is a much bigger one. Stone Mountain is just what we're looking at. It's just staring us back at our faces.
Yeah, I think it represents, it's much more representative of a larger movement than it is about Stone Mountain. So I hear what you're saying, Craig, about, Stone Mountain itself is not probably tipping the scales one way or another in these elections, but I think whether or not we as a state are appearing to be making progress in some way, shape, or form, it's a symbol of that progress or lack thereof, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And I did just look up, I did want to see, of course, the governor's race, that was an issue. I don't know if y'all remember, it did come up during the governor's race, and Brian Kemp did tweet at the time, "As governor, I will protect Stone Mountain and historical monuments in Georgia from the radical left. We should learn from the past, not attempt to rewrite it."
The radical left.
Just actually write the past.
Yeah.
So I'm saying just write it. Write it, W-R-I-T, and
Let's
write
change
it.
gears. Let's change gears. I want to move on to a bill that dropped in the Senate that we've been expecting for a long time, officially titled SB 106. What it is a Medicaid waiver. Now, what does that mean? I want to take a minute here because it can get confusing. It can get messy. I am not a healthcare expert, but I would like to think I understand the difference between expansion and a waiver. The state has long looked at, and all the states in the United States have long looked at Medicaid expansion since the passage of the Affordable Care Act. A waiver is a way to do something, quote unquote, experimental with that Medicaid expansion to adjust the rules by which you have to expand. Now, I'm getting some looks from my panel like they're going to correct me on some of this, and please come at me, because I get corrected every day by the office I work in. I'm talking about this issue. But so it's a way to change some of the qualifications of what Medicaid expansion means. So when you hear Medicaid waiver, what we're talking about that's in the floor right now has only a few specifics to it. The biggest specific is that it gives the governor the right to come up with a waiver plan. So really the only specific is that he has control to come up with a proposal to submit to the federal government. The other big specific is that normal Medicaid expansion covers 138% of the poverty line. So the federal poverty line is something like $12,500 or something like that for a household of one. So 138% of that is math, 16,000. That's regular expansion. Under the waiver that's proposed and in the Senate right now, it would cover 100% of the poverty line, being that 12,000 figure and below. So is this likely to go anywhere? I'll start with Pallavi, since she's in the Capitol. And, what's the general consensus around it right now?
It's a Band-Aid. I don't know if it's likely to go anywhere, given that, the Republicans are carrying it. So maybe just by that virtue, it might.
They have the governor's office, the House, and the Senate. So to say it's not going to go anywhere, are they going to lose enough votes to have it flip?
It might. Again, I think Medicaid expansion was such a huge deal in this past election. It depends on how they market that, but that there's really not that much. The biggest specific of that bill is that there are no specifics. It just gives the governor $1 million to play with, to throw to a consultant, and then they're going to come up with the plan, and then they're going to implement it, and then maybe some people get help.
Which that plan could include things that have been tossed around, like a work requirement for the benefit. Is there anything else that's being tossed around that could be or could not be in the eventual plan that comes about?
Well, we don't know that because they haven't said they're going to put a plan together. They're going to pay somebody. The federal government is going to give $1 million, and Georgia is going to give $1 million to a consultant to come study what we already know, and that is that Medicaid expansion works, and it is fiscally the right thing to do, and it's morally the right thing to do. I don't think Democrats are going to agree with it. Bob Trammell has come out pretty strongly against it, and he basically said that this doesn't go far enough. And a lot of people who are hurting right now, they want relief right now. They don't want to wait until a consultant tells them whether it's good or not. So
for the Republican side of it, Deal used to say that relying on, federal dollars for expansion was a mistake, that it's subject to change. There are a lot of states on the expansion program right now. Is that argument still going to hold water when it comes to this waiver program?
Looking at me.
You're the resident Republican.
I think that argument probably has less credence to it as each year passes or each couple of years passes. But again, and like as our host said, I am by no means a Medicaid expert, so I can't speak to the specifics of the bill. I can speak to the legislative reality that when you have every member of the Senate majority sign on to a bill, that bill is going to pass. That's a very remarkably rare thing when you have everybody on an entire caucus sign on something. I would agree with her characterization. It's a Band-Aid. You can call it a Band-Aid. You can call it a first step. You can call it whatever word you want to use as a preliminary move. Government as an entity always loves to study things. We've just left an issue where there's going to be lots of studying. So it was such an issue in the election, in the gubernatorial election. I think the governor understands that it's something that needs to be examined and needs to have some sort of fix to it. Now, will it be a fix that the Democrats are like? Probably not. But that's just the political reality of what happened in November. They to a degree, the issue was they won on the issue because it's something that's being addressed. But whether or not it's the fix that they like, that's a completely different subject.
The timing of this is predictable. By the way, the plan would go out from Governor Kemp's office in June of 2020, which, if you don't remember, is a pretty important election cycle. So I think, this is a move from his office to show that they're willing to take a measure towards that. I think the estimate number under their plan is that it would cover 300,000 versus the regular Medicaid expansion would get to 550 or 600,000 by some estimates. Is this a good start, or is it just not even enough?
I think the real question in my mind is, again, we're looking at Republicans responding to what happened in 2018, trying to hold on to what's inevitably going to happen in Georgia, but trying to stave it off in 2020. Now, what's interesting to me is it wasn't just an issue last year in Georgia. It was an issue nationally. And 3 ruby red states in Utah, Idaho, and Nebraska voted to expand Medicaid. And so I think when you're the newly elected governor of Georgia, you have to look at that, and you can no longer say, because you're not holding the line like you did in 2010, 11, 12, and all that, right? So there's starting to be sort of cracks in the resistance to doing something. The other part is that from a Georgia perspective, practically whatever comes out has to do something about the access to health care crisis. And I don't mean being able to go see a primary care physician. I mean that if you get in an accident on 16, where are you going to go? If you get in an accident on 319 in Tifton or 300 in Albany, Phoebe Putnam, but when you're traveling through the majority of the state where there's not a hospital, or in my hometown where we have what we call the Dewdrop Inn, like, please get me to Alabama. Don't put me there because you're going to die.
What good is coverage if there's nowhere to go?
Absolutely. So from a very practical perspective, we have to figure out something that's going to deal with that. But I do applaud the governor for looking at something, because Governor Dill did not do that.
I think the hospital's response to all this has been interesting as well. I mean, you and I were in the room with representatives of Northside Hospital, Wellstar. I believe Grady was there. Mm-hmm. And you very rarely find an issue that every hospital system agrees on. And they're universally against it. So it's telling the people who are actually going to be treating Georgians.
Well, they, to add some context to that, a lot of the hospitals and the hospital associations agree that the problem is not with Medicaid as a flawed system, it's with Medicaid reimbursement. That they're already hemorrhaging money on uninsured patients that come into their door. Medicaid patients on some procedures, if a patient comes in and thinks they have a headache and they give them an MRI and they run them through tests and it turns out they're fine, they send them home. Sometimes they're getting between $50 and $100 for that patient they just ran these diagnostic tests on through the emergency room reimbursement. So there are bigger problems beyond just the coverage gap. But I do think Craig's point has to be taken that it's a pretty unanimous consent from the Senate majority body. It's going to come over to the House where there are some differing opinions, not that many. There are, Democrats would need around 15 to 16 flips. Is that right? To get something to not go 16. Through the House. 16. There are 15 legislators that just went through the last election cycle and won by 55% or less that are Republicans. So there are a lot of people that are right on that line, but you've got to get all of them. You've got to convince everyone that's in a threatening seat to say, okay, let's not take the half measure, let's take the full measure. And I just don't know that that's convincing enough for every single one of those people.
And I mean, since you made this directed this as in a campaign perspective, stating that you have started to make, remember this is in a campaign context, starting to make strides in expanding Medicaid, or however you want to phrase it in your direct mail, is a pretty compelling story. Even if there's a number of people out there who want you to go to 100, you're going to score a lot of points in those 55% seats saying you got to 50.
Are there voters out there that are saying we could have done this forever ago, though? When did the Affordable Care Act pass, and how long have we had to start anything at all?
We've been talking about health care since Teddy Kennedy decided to run against Jimmy Carter in 1980.
So why has it taken this long for a waiver program if it was always on the table? I think would be some question.
Because the conversation changes every couple of years. The line moves every couple of years. Again, I'm not a medical care historian, but the medical situation in this country is a lot different than it was in 1980. I think Teddy was talking about medical changes in the mid 60s, even earlier than that. So throwing a fix to the healthcare system in a campaign context is fraught with danger, because you just don't know how they're going to respond to that. The public, there's only so much detail the public can handle. And that's why it's a fishy issue if that's how you're going to try to either save your seat or defeat somebody.
A thing that's striking to me, and Pallavi, you can comment as well, being in the Capitol, I see a lot of bills every day. We just had a bill for certificate of need that we're looking at that's 83 pages long. This bill that talks about Medicaid expansion is 3 pages, maybe 5 or 6 paragraphs.
That's a wonderful thing. You'll learn how wonderful that is. The shorter the bill, the better.
I would like to have some kind of content. Substance is something I really like, and that's why I said the biggest specific in this bill is that there are no specifics.
That was my point as well. That it gives so much freedom to the governor's office and this outside consultant to do what they want. I think if the bill had a couple more specifics in it, it would be more likely to get bipartisan support, because you at least know that Governor Kemp, when he starts to work on it, okay, maybe he's not going to put in a work requirement or something that Democrats could get behind. It would at least get a little closer. But again, not that they really need it.
Well, just be careful of unintended consequences when you're talking about a 500-page bill. There's a lot of gray in a 500-page bill.
This is a complicated problem with not an easy solution.
And as my colleague just said, this is obviously not the final bill. It's not like this is the last time this issue is going to be brought up before the year 2030.
But it could transfer a lot of power to somebody that's not the legislature, and it could not give them a seat at the table.
Well, the question about that, because I just don't know how it works with this, what they're talking about, but this plan that the governor would have to roll out by June of 2020, is that a plan that would then be voted upon by the legislature, or does he have the autonomy, whatever plan it is, to go ahead and implement it?
I believe it's just submitted to the federal government for approval, which will still have.
I don't think it comes back to the legislature. No.
So this is their only opportunity to vote.
I imagine it would depend on what he changes. If it's something that he changes that needs a change in the OCGA, then it would need to go back to the legislature. Well, nobody knows the answer to that.
There's another. That's actually a 2-waiver bill. The other waiver explores a relationship with the private insurance market, and if that sounds vague, it's because it is. So that's another way that it could somehow manage to get back to the legislature if the Medicaid waiver plan does something like alter the relationship between a benefits program and the private insurance market. That might be a reason that it could come back to the floor.
There's going to be another 30 bills pertaining to this particular subject before they go home.
This seems to be the most important one.
It is. But my point being is that, let's not take a fatalistic version that since something is not listed in these 3 pages, that means it's never going to be addressed.
But isn't that the only way you can? I mean, it would transfer all authority on that, and you have to. The legislature wants a seat at this table. They want to be able to be a part of this conversation because they were elected and on campaigning under Medicaid expansion.
Look, the bottom line is, I'm sorry.
You're good.
Medicaid expansion is very popular. It has, I think, 75% approval,
generally
51% of Republicans. So to say that, yeah, we have to make sure there's not unintentional consequences, but people like the idea of Medicaid expansion. And right now, this bill seems like a performance. It's, okay, we're going to set aside $1 million and we're going to study something we already know. And I think when it comes down to it, it's going to be too little too late. And I think Democrats will take the victory if they keep holding on to doing something that isn't a lot.
Play devil's advocate on Democrats not being thrilled about it. I mean, you mentioned 70+% approval rating on it. If this is a marginal next step, well, what's the repercussion of that? It means it stays in front of the public and it continues to be a campaign issue.
Well,
and at some point in time, it seems like it's getting worse and worse to be on the wrong side of this issue. Mm-hmm. There are some things where you're on the wrong side of the issue. No one cares. Everyone cares about health care.
To be fair, Leader Trammell of the Democratic Party says this is the wrong side of the issue, this waiver. And I think the approval comes for expansion that would cover between 500 and 600,000 people.
The 138%.
Yeah, the 138% of the poverty line. The approval rating, and I didn't do the poll, I don't know, but the approval rating might not be the same if people were to realize, oh, this wouldn't cover me. This would cover somebody else.
It's a nice term. You know, everybody's for tax cuts. You know, then when you actually get into the details, suddenly that tax cut isn't going to help me. You know, Medicare expansion sounds good. It's been something that, you know, it's like, I mean, can't even come up with the analogy. It's a term that's popular, like rebuilding your road or rebuilding your library. Then when you find out how much it's going to cost, holy Christmas! Mm-hmm. Suddenly it doesn't sound as good. Of course, you know.
Mm-hmm. So well, it's there's been a lot of conversation centered around the wording of polling for sure. Medicaid expansion or Medicare for all or some of these issues that very controversial. But when you start talking about the exact wording of it, it dives down into a whole different way.
I think the moral of the story here is the devil's in the details.
Yeah.
For both the Republicans and the Democrats.
I would love
so
to see
maybe
I know, me too. I would love to find the devil at some point.
What is this? This is what day is this? What day was this?
15.
This was day 15. Brian Kemp is going to be governor short of a disaster for 4 sessions. That's 160 days. This is day 15. Somebody do the percentage there.
But the plan comes June 2020, and authorization to him could leave in the next 20 to 25 days. This could be the last opportunity to have a say in this for the legislature.
I would imagine that the minority would find this as a victory. This was an issue that was a seminal issue in the gubernatorial race last year. Republicans obviously heard that this was an issue that had to be addressed. Within the first 15 days, the governor brought forward a bill on this subject. Now, is this an issue that gives the minority everything they want in one shot? No, of course not. It's never done that way. But I would take a slight victory lap if I was in the minority that the bill was put forward ahead of many other issues that the majority is a little more conscious and favorable of. Now, I know it's very difficult to take half a loaf when you want the full loaf, and you spent 2 years arguing for the full loaf. But sometimes you got to take the half the loaf or a quarter of the loaf, whatever percentage you want to take.
I'm not sure that people know that there's a loaf of bread. It could be a stone. Right, and so that's the deal.
Crumbs.
So that's
or a bagel.
Or it could be a bagel. I mean, and here's the deal. Again,
I'll take a Pop-Tart. I mean, I'm not.
I could go for one of those right now.
I mean, I understand. I mean, I worked in the Capitol when I was in the minority. So I recognize that how crappy the legislative system can be when my senator introduces a bill about school reform, gets a hearing in the Senate Education Committee, and gets defeated. And then the chairman of that committee, Faye Smith of Milledgeville, introduces the exact same bill verbatim. And amazingly, it passes through the Senate and amazingly passes through the House and is signed by Governor Barnes. That's the political and legislative reality of the world. And that senator at the time was Casey Cagle. Do with what you want with it.
Yeah. So here's my thing. I don't want the conversation to be about majority-minority parties in this. This is it should be about. And here's why. Because I think that both Democrats, Republicans, and Libertarians can all agree that this bill, it sounds like, is saying, trust me, trust government. And I find it a little ironic that as sort of the resident Republican, and just for all those out here, I do work with Republicans and Democrats, so I don't want to be cast.
Throw the resume out there.
Just saying. But
what do you do, Fred? Tell me more.
But to say that just trust government, they'll figure it out, that seems to be kind of an anathema or contrary to the whole thought there.
Well, so conservatives believe in trusting government just in certain areas. It's libertarians.
Is healthcare one of those?
Healthcre's not one.
It has become that way. I mean, for better or for worse, love it or hate it. I always say that the healthcare debate in this country took a significant turn in 1993 when President Clinton and the First Lady began the conversation and started a process in which healthcare is now considered a right instead of a privilege. In the good old days, healthcare was considered a privilege. You did not have a right to healthcare. If you had a disease and you can afford to pay for it, you went to your church, you went to your family, you went to other private means. And if you didn't, now it's become a right. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. But once that became a right and became an issue that both parties have to treat and have to recognize because it's what the people are looking for, then both parties have changed their perspective on it.
Again, let's tell the whole story. So the good old days when Stone Mountain was erected, that was the little thing. But in between there, you had a little thing called corporate-sponsored healthcare, right? So that is where you work for a company, for GM or whatever, a stable company. It's around 20, 40, 50 years. You get your pension. They provide your health care. Yes, President and Mrs. Clinton obviously put it at the very front as a forefront issue, but there was also this whole little thing called globalism that occurred at the same time, overlapped with the Clinton presidency. And so we no longer see people going to work for the company for 20 or 30 years, right? So it's not just that they elevate the conversation. At the same time, the provision or offerings of it, as well as the cost of it, happen to spike along with the provisions of healthcare dropping, right? So you have companies that have 1099s instead of W-2s, right? So
I agree. Everything has changed in the regard of how we view healthcare and how healthcare is done. Going back to your story about the headache, the guy going to the emergency room having a headache and the doctor wanting to give him an MRI. I mean, we all know the other side of that story. If the doctor doesn't give him an MRI and the guy's headache turns into an embolism or whatever the correct term is and dies, that doctor's not practicing medicine anywhere in this country ever again. I mean, everything has changed from whatever year you want to start the timeline on. I was just stating that starting, I think, in the early 90s with the Clintons, there became an element where both parties had to examine their relationship to the healthcare issue that they didn't have to do in 1960. It wasn't an issue in 1960.
I'm going to throw you a bone. One of the things I'm really hopeful about from the State of the Union is that I'm hopeful that President Trump will be successful in getting a published list of what it costs to provide services, right? You can go to McDonald's or the Varsity or whatever and know how much you're going to pay for this, that, and the other. Same thing for legal services. Is this number, $200 an hour, $600 or whatever. When you go to the hospital, you have no idea what it's going to cost, right? Mm-hmm. And so, go to Old North Fulton Medical, to get a MRI might cost one thing, go to Grady, it costs another, and all that. So until we can actually have some accountability and transparency around what it actually costs to provide these services, I think everything else is going to fall short. So I'm really hopeful that the president will be successful in that, as he talked about in the State of the Union.
Pallavi is the only one who shares my similar employment. You please let me know when you find an employer that will provide constant health care for you. When Fred was talking about that, I forgot.
Might both get fired after this.
I had forgotten those existed. I was thinking, oh boy, that sounds nice. All right, we've got to move on to what's got to be the number one story out of Georgia this week, which is House Speaker of the Representatives David Ralston from Blue Ridge, Georgia, had a story published in the AJC this week that a lot of people are calling new. I think all of us at this table might agree that it's kind of old news that's getting new fire under it. If you missed the story, go on, give it a quick read. But essentially what it is that Speaker Ralston has been utilizing a law from 1905 that has allowed him to delay court cases in his private practice of being an attorney based on a conflict with legislative duties. Not a conflict of interest, but a conflict of schedule. So he will have a court hearing on a specific date, inside or outside of session. This has happened both ways. He will push it to a different date and cite legislative conflicts. He's done this for all sorts of clients. The ones noted in the article are not the most friendliest of people.
Bad.
This kind of story about Speaker Ralston has been published before. Is anything going to change about this, or are things going to go about business as usual?
Doesn't look like it.
Who wants to jump in first?
The only people who can hold him accountable are the judges. And this is where I think local elections really matter because no one pays attention to these elections. And if you live in one of those places where a judge is his buddy and he's saying, yeah, go ahead, come later, we'll have this rapist be out on the streets for 5 more years, then you need to show up to those elections and vote these people out. But other than the judges, I don't see anyone else holding him accountable. I think he'll just keep getting away with it. And it's been going on for years. It's not new.
Let me push back. Is it getting away with it? Because I know it doesn't look good, but it's legal. And he's a very powerful person. He has a lot of connections, and you can call it what you want, but the legality of it isn't super in question because of this statute, as ancient as it is, still in place. So isn't the right repercussion for the legislators to update the law, change the law, saying that he can only take delays during legislative session, which is 40 days out of the year?
Well, is anyone else abusing it? Or does it look like anybody else is abusing it? Or are we kind of centering an entire law and trying to legislate one person's behavior?
I would have to imagine that people have used it. I don't know for the same reason.
I don't know either, and I'd hate to criticize a legislator without any knowledge about that.
But this is the reality you have with legislators that work a 40-day legislative schedule and then have private practice outside of there. I mean, there's going to be conflicts. We had people from Votes Today that were excused from conflicts, be it a child illness or anything. So I understand, I understand the law being in place. Is there a way to go about it that either targets people who abuse it, or is it just Speaker Ralston, or do they just remove them as Speaker?
Yes, you could remove them. You remove them as Speaker.
But that's not going to happen.
But then if he stayed in the House, he would just continue using the provision as a sitting member. He doesn't have to be Speaker. Mm-hmm. It's only on the front page of the AJC because he's the Speaker.
Exactly right.
I have no doubt that there are other attorneys in the history of the legislature that have used the same thing. Mm-hmm. I wish I remember the history of Tom Murphy better to know. I wouldn't be surprised if I'm not even going to finish the sentence.
There's a difference between pushing something back a couple of months and pushing something back years.
I mean, some of these cases have been pushed back like 10 years.
Well,
the rape case was, I think, 7 years.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at the article, I think 50 something out of the 70 cases, those trials were out of session.
Right.
So is it really that important for you to show up to a Republican Party dinner and cite that, I don't know, I'm just making this up, and cite that as a conflict, then not take your client to court who has been accused of raping a child?
Outside of session, you're pretty flexible in what you can cite as a legislative conflict, especially if the judges are
okay with it
in your area and okay with it because you're Speaker of the House and that's a nice friend to have.
So the checks and balances come in with the judges, maybe with the DAs, and that's where people have to start paying attention.
Yeah, I would agree that obviously I think the local district attorneys and the judges do have some accountability here. There is obviously a provision in the U.S. Constitution for speedy trial. I forget which amendment that is. Mm-hmm. I mean, not knowing specifics and not knowing why the law in 1905 was passed the way it was, it's hard to really comment on it. But I would agree that if I was a DA and this was one of my cases, I'd be piping mad.
Mm-hmm. Fred, I don't want to put you on the spot, but can you give me a percentage that Speaker Ralston is still Speaker on Legislative Day 40?
Pick between 100 and
350%.
Maybe even higher.
Add a zero to that. So no, he's going to be Speaker.
For those of our listeners that might be a little lost, he's incredibly well liked by both parties. How many Democrats voted against his speakership this year?
Just the leadership, and that's almost tradition.
Yeah, it's kind of like a formality at this point. So maybe 9, 10 Democrats and maybe 3 or 4 Republicans. That's an overwhelming majority to have as a Republican speaker in a House that's 100 to 75.
And that swings both ways. The Republicans voted for Tom Murphy. Bob Irvin, the Republican leader at the time, always voted for Tom Murphy. Mm-hmm. There's no benefit to not voting for him at that time. What do you gain? What do you gain from it? I mean, unless you're got a particular grudge.
What do you gain from removing him as Speaker?
You lose a lot if you're a Democrat.
He will undoubtedly be replaced by someone who maybe is
you asked the question, what do you gain? I mean, if
you're a Republican or a Democrat,
I can answer probably either way. The two Dems at the table here probably wouldn't want me to appoint, to speak for Democrats.
Please.
What they would gain.
Please,
I would be pretty darn scared.
Yeah.
Because Speaker Ralston, by his previous actions and his previous comments, is what I would call a moderate Republican.
Absolutely.
I think
especially in today's day and age. So be careful what you wish for, because who comes out of the Republican caucus as the Speaker nominee could be significantly worse if you're a Democrat.
Well, have any people wished for him to be removed that actually have the power or agency to organize that sort of thing?
Not that I know of.
I
But
don't think so
going
either.
back to that, I mean, he has been a firm barrier against RFRA laws, any kind of religious freedom laws. He was the reason why HB 51 in 2016, which we called the Rapist Protection Bill, it got defeated. He's been really good on gun issues, on religious freedom issues, and if we replace him with someone even a little bit to the right, Democrats lose out on a lot, because the truth of the matter is we're in the minority in both the House and the Senate. And right now, he's stopping a lot of bills that we don't have the numbers to stop.
It's hard to tell from the outside how much doesn't come to the floor because of the speaker. And I think that's an important calculation that people are going to have to make. I think...
And you'll never know.
Yeah.
And if you ever do find out, it means he's a bad speaker.
Right.
And that's for any speaker in any state and any legislative body in this country. The best speakers are the ones you don't see what they're doing.
I think the court of public opinion is going to kind of take the lead on this one. I know the Georgia Democratic Party had a spokesperson put out a statement that basically said Speaker Ralston needs to remember his priorities and remember that he's a legislator first and an attorney, so something along those lines. But it did not call for him to be removed. It did not call for any sort of group opposition or anything like that. It just said he needs to shape up his act, which I think a lot of people agree on, but I don't think action against him is really in the near future.
I wonder if he will be more threatened by a Republican primarying him than anything else.
Primarying him in his
Are you
district?
talking about in his district or within the caucus?
Both.
Well, he's already been primaried the last two sessions, and neither of them were close. They make a lot of noise. One was a very popular wrestling coach. I apologize to his family. I can't remember his name. And there was some concern that the speaker would be defeated or challenged, and the speaker blew him out. And then the guy from last year, or maybe they took a pass in 16, I don't remember. But he's had two in the last couple of cycles, and they've been destroyed. And there's nobody in the Republican caucus now who is going to challenge the speaker.
And
it's just not happening.
We have to remember the original story that we're talking about centers around the idea that he has friends and he has connections. And because
he's been
of
doing
that,
it a long time.
right? And because of that, when it gets to election season, he has over $1 million. Which,
Let me say that one more
boy,
time.
what I could do with that.
Let me correct myself. I didn't mean that those would be feasible options, but I think comparatively, Democrats are less of a threat to him than his own party.
Do we think that's true?
Oh, yeah.
I think so, too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the speaker is sitting in his office worrying right now about what the minority is going to do to him.
No. A rare, quiet moment of consensus from our podcast. Well, to wrap up this week, we're going to go around the table and talk about what we're watching in the next week of news. Let's start to my left here. Pallavi.
Well, President Trump came up with a little bit of an announcement this morning. So I'm excited to see who is going to be the first state or the first people to file against that and how
His state of emergency.
his state
is
of
what we're talking
emergency.
about.
Already stole mine. Dang.
Sorry, quote unquote emergency.
Hawaii or California? What are the odds?
California.
Oh, are we betting?
Over Hawaii?
California.
Okay, I'll go with California.
Governor, is it
Newsom.
Brown? Newsom. Sorry.
Brown.
I'm traveling back in time.
Oh,
Governor
yeah.
Newsom has already pulled his National Guard troops from the border down there. I would think that's probably his next step. But anyways, Craig.
Keeping this on a local idea, I am paying attention suddenly to HB 302, the Presumption of Local Business Design Standards by Vance Smith, who's led a very interesting career in the Georgia legislature. This would preempt the ability of local governments to enforce and regulate building design elements for residential homes, which as a chief of staff to a local mayor, you can imagine what we would think of that.
For or against?
What do you think? Whenever you see the word preempt,
Yeah, preempt is not a popular
preempt is
word.
not a popular word
unless
for
it's
local
followed
government.
by criminals.
Preempt
or...
is not a popular word when it comes to cities, because you have to always remember the relationship between cities and counties and the state is always a difficult one. Cities and counties only exist at the largesse of the state. They are created by the state.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes the state thinks that they should do whatever they want to cities and counties. Cities and counties don't see it that way.
Sorry about that. Well, who's the sponsor?
Van Smith. Great guy.
All right, well,
I he's been around for a long
You're
time.
lobbying now. Pallavi and I. Are
He used to be DOT commissioner. He used to be DOT commissioner, and he was a legislator from that area for a long time before he left to be DOT commissioner. But very nice guy.
Hans.
All right, I'm up. Well, Pallavi, yes, she did steal mine, but I'll put a different little wrinkle on it. I am watching to see which of the Democratic candidates for president in 2020 fully embrace the idea of using the emergency shutdown as a part of their campaign platform and take this as a gift rather than something they want to be pissed off about.
I noticed what you posted on Facebook about Democrats
Yeah.
salivating. After I stopped shaking, I think I was salivating a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
You might want to go to a doctor. I don't know.
Did we have the healthcare debate yet?
Fred.
Teasing. So I'm watching the MARTA vote in Gwinnett. We've successfully expanded MARTA in Clayton County in 2014, expanded the system in 2016 in the city of Atlanta. And so this is the first attempt in quite some time to expand the system northward. I think Gwinnett took a vote in 1990 and shot it down, and Gwinnett voted against T-Splost in 2012 pretty heavily, 71% against. So this is a third bite of the apple. So we're watching to see if people will get on board. Boop, boop.
Predictions?
Depends how much money they want to spend.
Well, so
It takes money to get people out to vote. Who's going to spend the money?
Especially when
all those nice, juicy, traditionally now Democratic precincts and House districts that want MARTA. Is anybody going to spend the money to get them out? That's what it boils down to.
This thing, and this is my life right now, right? And so what's really interesting about this is you have the very popular Republican chairwoman of the county commission, Charlotte Nash, out there appearing everywhere she possibly can to talk about this. And then you also have Stacey Abrams, who barely lost to Brian Kemp last year, who has joined the fight. And so you have two women and two who are on opposite sides of the political spectrum, who are both engaged and making sure people understand the benefits of this. So this is going to be interesting. I'm sure there'll be opposition, so I'm also watching for that. That's going to emerge. But this is my life right now, and it's
When's the vote?
March 19th. Early voting starts February 25th.
It's coming up.
Okay.
So in 10 days.
Real quick,
But
I'm managing a race, a city council race up in Snellville, and the way they have these elections are so ridiculous.
Yeah.
You go to your regular precincts to vote for MARTA, but you have to go to City Hall to vote for your city council person.
Yeah,
Yes.
they did that in.
So when
they
you
did
do
that in
this,
Sandy.
Yeah.
They did that in Sandy Springs 3-4 years ago in a special election for city council. You had to go to a physically a different location, and you actually you filled out a good old fashioned 19th century ballot.
That's hard enough to make people
circled the
go
name
once.
and
That's intentional.
turnout was
once you start making
Guys,
that noise, I'm going to take it as a
This
given.
is a whole nother
I don't know the
episode.
background of the Snellville City Council election. Snellville, by its very nature, is dysfunctional. But I'm just saying it's not new. It has happened in the past.
And Craig and Pete, the interesting thing about Gwinnett for this one is that Lawrenceville actually has their brunch bill vote on March 19th as well. And you have the same dynamic there in Lawrenceville, where you have to vote in one place on the brunch bill and vote in a different location for the for MARTA.
We in Johns Creek, we had a special election at the same time of the Karen Handel Ossoff race, the first round, not the second round.
Grace for Bob
Right.
seat, yeah.
To replace Tom Price. We could vote in the same room. You just had to go to a different set of machines. So on this wall, you get to vote for Karen Handel or John Ossoff. On this wall, you get to vote for Johns Creek City Council. It was pretty funny. And watching voters, they go to the one machine. They see the two people running for city council. Like, where's John Ossoff? And they just push a button and they go over to the other side. And they get to vote in that race. I felt bad for the two members of the two people running for Johns Creek City Council because they got drowned out by that race.
Yeah.
I only feel bad for one because he lost. The other guy won, so I feel bad for him.
Bob Gray, I did a city council race. I didn't do his congressional race, but I did a city council race in 2014. Then, of course, he resigned to run for that congressional seat there. I did not do his congressional race. Bob's a
Again,
great guy.
spinning out the resume.
You worked for Bob Gray. I did not know that. We'll have to talk about that.
I know
Fred
he and the
really
mayor
doesn't wanna talk
they
about
didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things. About a lot of things, I mean anything.
Hey, that's not true. That's not true. He and Bob are good friends.
All right, that's going to do it for us this week on the Georgia Politics Podcast. We will see everybody next week with a whole new set of stories to talk about. So until then, thanks for listening. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube, and subscribe to the podcast. Share it with your friends, and we'll see everyone next week.